And we have some stories that seem like, and Paul's going to probably start speaking about this, seems like some of these beings didn't really have the best interest of humanity in mind. And then we have other ones that did. So whether we just called all these beings Elohim, maybe the specific ones were the ones that were benevolent, this is all going to be what we're exploring today. And I don't have the answers either, because what I do is when I don't know something, I do an event on it. So that's where we're at today. So we're learning this together. So let's get into our next presenter, Paul Wallis. Here we go.
Whenever we tell the stories, the folklore of another culture, we immediately distort them. Simply by expressing another culture's mythology in our own language, we distort it. And never is this more true than when we speak of another culture's gods. We use the word gods in English, but what was the word the original culture used? Because the word God comes with all kinds of baggage in the English language. What word did the other culture use in the stories that we're translating? And what were the associations embedded with their words? We use the word gods, but what word did the original culture use? When I say God or gods, we're thinking of a supernatural, transcendent, almighty, probably imagined being. But what was the word in the original culture's story, and what were the associations embedded with that word? Because the associations probably weren't the same. My way into this subject has been through studying the Bible, and the earliest word the Bible translates as God is the word Elohim, and at root that word means powerful ones. And though in conventional translations you'll see Elohim translated as God with a capital G or gods with a small g, aka false gods, it at root means powers or powerful ones. It is a masculine plural form noun. It isn't concretized. There is a singular and evocative form that allows you to refer to or address an Elohim in the singular. So we have the words El and Elohe. But Elohim, despite being translated as God in the singular many times over, and then randomly in the plural in other places, it just means powerful ones. And it takes plural verb forms, plural adjectives, it exhibits plural behaviors. The Elohim arrive as the Tzeva Hashemayim, the airborne armies. They gather in council, the Ba'adat El, the power council. And as I show in my Books of the Eden series, the powerful ones of the Hebrew tradition are in effect a retelling of the stories of the Anunnaki, bequeathed to us by the Babylonians. The Anunnaki were sky people. And so already we need to pause and say, wait a minute, these are not gods. These are powerful beings who have airborne technology, who arrive from the sky. In the Enuma Elish, the story begins with the descent of the gods from the sky. They have weapons of mass destruction. They can manipulate the weather, but they can also mingle with human beings and introduce new technologies to them. These are all part of the Anunnaki stories of the Babylonian telling. So they're advanced beings, but in what sense are they gods? In the English sense of the word. They're not transcendent. They're not supernatural. They are other flesh and bone people, but who have more advanced technology and who have arrived from the skies. So we've got the Elohim of the biblical tradition, the Anunnaki of the Babylonian tradition. The Agigi is another set of beings in the Babylonian telling, and that word means observers. And they are so flesh and blood that they can come intermingle with human beings and then crossbreed with human beings. So those are not gods in the English sense of the word God. They're another kind of being. So in the Babylonian telling, you've got observers. In the Ethiopic book of Enoch, you've got the watchers, a very similar word, again associated with advanced beings who come to the planet from space and then hybridize with human beings. So gods doesn't really fit the telling of those stories with all the associations that we in the English language lay on top of the word gods. We're talking about powerful ones, sky people, observers, watchers. And I wonder if it would be more helpful for us to tell the stories using those words rather than our conventional translation of gods. Plato, the great philosopher-scientist of Athens, very helpfully defined for us what he meant by the word gods. Now, he was writing in the 4th century before Common Era, and he produced a fabulous synthesis of international thought, which he then argued for on the basis of logic applied to things we can all observe. And he said this regarding gods. And in his book Timaeus and Critias, he has this little section describing 4 different kinds of being. There are 4 kinds of living creature: gods, birds, water animals, land animals. Now note that nowhere does he say the first is imagined, the rest are real. He says no, these are 4 kinds of beings, 4 kinds of creatures, and the first in the list is gods. So what are these beings that have been translated in English as gods? Let's see how he goes on. There are 4 kinds of living creature: the heavenly race of gods, the race of winged creatures that travels by air, the sort that lives in water, and the sort that has his feet and lives on dry land. So that's a schema that's easy to follow. There's the land animals, the beings that live in the water, the beings that fly in the air, and the gods who live up here in what we would call space. The divine form he made mostly of fire, so that it should be as bright and beautiful to look at as possible. And he made it spherical, like the universe, and set it to follow the movement of the highest intelligence, distributing it around the circle of the heavens. So now we realize that by gods, Plato is actually speaking about heavenly bodies, celestial bodies. He's talking about stars and planets. But elsewhere in his writings, he says there are a couple of ways we use the word gods. On the one hand, it refers to the personification of celestial bodies, the personification of the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets. On the other hand, it can refer to advanced beings. And when he talks about advanced beings, he's talking about Greek mythology. He's talking about the Greek gods, Zeus, Prometheus, and all the others. And so it's very helpful that he's telling us there's one way the word is used, which is really an ideation, a personification of a heavenly body. And then there's this other more concrete way it's used of advanced people, advanced beings. And Plato does use the word God in a more ultimate way as well, to refer to the source of the cosmos. And we can see that dual use of the word in cultures all around the world. The personification of planets and stars was really a global phenomenon, and even the personification of constellations. But stories about advanced beings are endemic as well. So the word gods as a personification, it could be planets, could be the personification of the storm or of lightning, of the wind, volcanoes, earthquakes, the underworld, the sea, the sky, the sun, the moon, and of course, beings associated with the altered state. And so there's a sense in which God can refer to our interpolation of natural phenomena. There's the wind, and so we speak of the wind as a being, the god of the wind. There is volcanism, and we refer to it by personifying it. There is the underworld, and so we have the god of the underworld. And so It is a projection, it's an imagination, it's an ideation, it's not a being, it's not an entity. So again, to use the word gods, sometimes it's helpful to translate what we mean. However, I think through the ages we have made that the single lens through which we listen to the stories of the gods of indigenous cultures around the world. And we assume that we're listening to an abstraction, an imagination, instead of to the detail of the story. And one place where it's easy to make this confusion is when we have stories of beings associated with the weather. Now, I certainly found this in my recent travels in Turkey, listening to the stories of the Urartian people who lived there in the Bronze Age. Their culture, the United Kingdom of Van, straddled what today is modern Turkey and modern Armenia. And the beings that they venerated, they called the Tingir. And some of them were associated with the weather, with the sun and the moon. Suni, Irmushini, Haldi, Arubani, Teshaba. But what I noted as I decoded the symbology left behind in their ancient carvings, and as I listened to the content of their inscriptions carved into basalt in cuneiform script, is that these beings are not gods in the sense you and I would think of as a god. They're not supernatural transcendent beings. They are finite beings with finite powers, advanced but finite powers, who lived with our ancestors for a finite time and did particular definite things. That's the Urartian account of the Tingir. And so when anthropologists and archaeologists say, oh, the Tingir were the gods of the Urartian people, no, they weren't. They were the Tingir, who were finite beings with finite powers who lived here for a finite time doing particular things. But because they're associated with the weather, very often that reductive thinking clicks in and we think, oh, a god of the weather, oh, a god of the sun. But I note that the Tingir were limited in their powers. They weren't powerful enough to prevent the chaos of an ecological cataclysm. But they did have the technology, the agricultural science, to help the Urartians' ancestors recover after that cataclysm. So that's the Tingir. The cover of my latest book, The Eden Enigma, shows you what the Tingir looked like. This is in fact an Assyrian carving of what anthropologists call a genie. So what is a genie? A person with advanced powers that we can't explain. It's the same kind of being the Urartians referred to as Tingir. And this is the way they were recalled, with the pine cone and bucket in hand. Just like the Tingir of the Urartian people, the winged genies of Assyria were associated with advanced technology, agricultural science, who lived among our ancestors for a finite period in the deep past. And I found that these beings were not worshipped in the sense that you and I mean by the word worship. No, they were remembered with love and gratitude. And that was the nature of the ceremonial life associated with these beings. I was very privileged to meet Mehmet Kushman, who's known as the last Urartian because of his familiarity with the ancient Urartian language and his ability to write it in cuneiform script. This is a very treasured item that I have, carved by Mehmet Kushman with my name in cuneiform script in the Urartian language. Now, I don't know what my name meant in the Urartian language, which again brings us back to the need to listen to the inscriptions and the stories and understand what is it the Urartians were saying about their Tingir, because they weren't saying they were gods in the sense that you and I would mean. In my book, The Eden Enigma, I show that there's a strong connection between the Urartians' Bronze Age stories of the Tingir with the Norse stories of the Aesir of Asgard in Asaland. And I argue in The Eden Enigma that Asaland is the territory of ancient Armenia, and we're told about the great migration of the Aesir from Asaland into Northern Europe and Scandinavia. Snorri Sturluson, the 13th century post-Viking chieftain, tells these stories, gathers together the ancestral stories, and expresses them for a new generation. And he understood that Odin and those who moved with him were not imagined supernatural beings, but were in fact real people, an advanced human culture which moved from ancient Armenia and with ease was able to take territory in Northern Europe and Scandinavia because they were more advanced, because they had more advanced technology, which included flight technology. And if that's a completely new thought to you, let me recommend to you David Lovegrove's new book, Viking Superpowers, and he might just change your mind on that topic. So when we think of beings like the Anunnaki or the Elohim or the Aesir or the Tingir, who appear to have advanced technology, flight technology, agricultural science, those are the particular attributes that are being explained to us, not supernatural, not transcendent, not almighty, not imagined, but advanced beings who are remembered in ancestral story. And I think if we try and keep our vocabulary close to that of the original languages, if we go to the root meanings of those words, then I think we begin to see that a very particular story is being told about these beings, a story that's been dismissed because we've translated it as gods, and therefore we put it into the religious basket, the imagined basket, and so we can disregard it as telling us anything about history. Going back to the root meanings raises the question again, is there real memory of real events being carried by these ancient stories? Snorri Sturluson would say yes, and in the Eden Enigma, I say yes. Enigmatic, advanced leaders, conquering territory and ruling over the human beings on that territory is a theme echoed in the Vedas with their descriptions of the kings and their flight technology, flying cities, and Vimana. So this idea of advanced beings who governed over territory and the human beings on that territory, who had flight technology and other advanced science, we find this echoed in the Vedas, in the stories of the kings and their flying cities and their flying vimanas. We would be wrong to retell those stories as stories of gods, as supernatural beings. And the interesting thing about the Vedic telling of these stories is it's very nuts and bolts when it comes down to describing their advanced weaponry, their flight technology. And so the stories of the kings and the Vedas fits quite nicely alongside the stories of the Anunnaki and the Elohim and the Aesir and the Tingir. Through the writings of the Greek Babylonian priest Berossus, we have an account of the Babylonian belief about the origins of human civilization, describing the Sumerian miracle where all the accoutrements of civilization seem to emerge in one great leap forward. The explanation is that our human ancestors had contact not with gods, but with beings that on first inspection look like monsters. These are the stories of Oannes and the Apkallu, and they're not described as gods, they're described as very mystifying physical beings. The Apkallu were sages, they were wise ones, they had advanced technology, they had higher forms of science, which they then taught to the ancestors of the Sumerians. And Berossus says that mathematics, cosmology, civil engineering, record keeping, reading, writing, legal systems, banking systems, money systems, the canalization of the environment, megalithic building, and advanced agriculture were all taught by these sages. So again, these are not gods, they are non-human tutors who lived with our ancestors for a finite period. It's a much more scaled down story than if we translate it as, oh, these were the gods of the Sumerians. These were the gods of the Babylonians. No, these were the teachers of. Let's leave it saying what it says and then decide if we think it's real or fiction or how it relates to real cultural memory. But let the story say what it says. They were sages. They were teachers who were here in the deep past. In the Northern Territory of Australia, the Aboriginal people of the Yolngu tribe carry a similar, though rather different story. The Yolngu people's story is fascinating because Aboriginal Australians are renowned for having a very intimate and balanced connection with nature. And yet the Yolngu people say there was a time when their ancestors did not have that knowledge. They did not know which plants were good to eat, which were good to avoid, which were good for medicines, which were good for higher consciousness. They didn't know what to fish from the oceans and eat and what to fish and throw back. They didn't know how to live in balance with nature, but they learned it from beings who taught them, non-human beings who taught them. And they don't use the word gods, they use a word that we've translated into English as spirits. They speak of the Mimi spirits. But when you and I use the word spirits, we're thinking of a non-physical, non-corporeal, will-o'-the-wisp kind of being. That is not what the Yolngu people meant, because they give a physical description of what these beings look like. And the Yolngu elders say that the Mimi were resident in the land. They were living on the land before they, the Yolngu people, arrived in this part of Australia. The Mimi were incredibly thin beings, tall and thin. And they called them spirits because they seemed to be able to arrive and disappear on the wind. And in many ancient cultures, if you find the word spirit being used, or the word that we translate as spirit, what they're actually talking about is beings that we don't know how they turn up and we don't know how they disappear. So if a being flies down to the planet's surface from the moon, that person is a spirit because we don't know how they just did that. If a person materializes in your house or in your village, as if from nowhere, that person must be a spirit because we don't know how they got here and we don't know where they go after they've interacted. So that's the sense of the word spirit in many ancient cultures. And we are told the Mimi were physical beings because their physicality is described to us. And they were physically observed by the Yolngu people. And so the Yolngu people observed the dance of the hunt, the dance of the harvest, the dance of the fishing expedition. And they learned how to do it themselves through physical observation. That is the story of the Mimi spirits. Now again, they were not eternal beings. They lived together with the ancestors of the Yolngu people for a finite period. And so if we call them gods, we distort the story. If we call them spirits, we distort the story. We just have to allow the story to speak to us in its own terms. But it fits within this family of narratives in which ancient people say, we learned our skills from non-human others who in the deep past lived among us for a finite time. It's worth noting there is another way in which we've used the word gods in the past, and it's to describe ascended masters. So if you read Greco-Roman mythology, you will read of heroic figures who at the end of their lives they are killed or they vanish, they go missing, and then the clues come that they have ascended and are now to be found among the gods. They are now gods. And so this would be the stories of Asclepius, Orpheus, Hercules, Jesus. They all fit into that schema. They are now found among the gods. They have become divine. This is the story of their apotheosis. And so there are all these ways in which we use the word God, the personification of natural forces, the personification of a planet or a star, advanced beings who lived among us in the past, beings who came and went in ways we couldn't understand, beings who had technology that we didn't have before, and people who, through some means or another, either through being a hybrid of human and higher being, or through a process of ascension and evolution, have become divine and are now among the gods. And of course we have the hint of that in the Bible as well, in figures like Enoch and figures like Elijah, who begin their lives as human beings, but who end their lives ascending to be among the gods. Traditionally, we've considered the feathered serpents of the Mayan people to be the gods of the Maya. But again, this is to distort what they're telling us. In some places, the feathered serpents sound very much like highly skilled, advanced beings with advanced technology, with skills in genetic engineering. And yet in other places, the dragon, heart of the sky, I think would be an example of this, sounds very much like the personification of a heavy piece of equipment. And the dragon may be some kind of a craft, some kind of airborne technology that is being described to us, with textures that sound like technology and not the textures of some kind of a creature. And so as to what a dragon is or a god is, I think it's important to recognize there may be more than one explanation. There may be more than one story being told us. For me, the word God is fraught with difficulties because it comes in English attached to thousands of years of religious connotations. God the King, the one who must not be offended, he who must be obeyed, the alpha male of all alpha males, the King of Kings. God the puppet master who makes everything that happens happen. God the tyrant, who on his whim decides who will be consigned to heaven and who will be consigned to hell. And so because of those distortions, sometimes I wonder if it's helpful not to use the word and simply say what we mean to avoid confusion. Personally, I like the Greek word theos, God, as envisioned by Plato as, to use modern language, the unified field of consciousness which fractalized to form the material cosmos. I find that a helpful way of thinking of God. That's a concept large enough to deserve the word God, in my opinion. And then I like how Paul, the Apostle Paul, expresses that Greek idea of theos. And he does this in the book of Acts, in chapter 17, when he's speaking to a non-religious audience, non-Jewish audience, non-Christian audience at least, but he needs to clarify his terms. And so Paul says, by theos I mean the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being, of which we are all offspring. And I find that a wonderful vision of God. I find that a concept large enough to merit the word God. And for anything else, I prefer not to use the word because I simply think it distorts what the ancients were telling us. I think that when we want to dig deeper into ancestral story, into what our ancestors wanted to tell us about the origins of humanity, the origins of the cosmos, how our planet reached the form we're all familiar with today, I think we should not settle for a single story. And I think there's a temptation to embrace the familiar stories and then put the unfamiliar ones on the back burner. Whereas those unfamiliar stories may simply be looking at things from a different angle. And that's why I think it can be unhelpful to try and Treat it like a jigsaw where you're trying to fit all these different narratives together to make a single picture. In which case is Thor Zeus? Is Yahweh Enlil? Are the feathered serpents of China Enki and Ninmah? Is Odin the same as Haldi? No, they're different stories. They're different cultures who have had a different vantage point and are sharing different memories. They may overlap. They may be giving us similar information, but they're not necessarily telling us all about the same particular beings. I find it helpful to see each story as a new lens, bringing different things into focus. I think a single story is going to distort the complexities of what happened in the deep past and the complexities of the stories left behind by our ancestors. But each new lens brings into focus something different. And if I think of the optician layering one lens in front of another in that little device and saying, better with or without? My answer is always better with. And that's what motivates me in my ongoing journey of research. So thank you for listening, and it's great to have spent this time with you.